I don't even know where to start. My head's still spinning from everything that's happened in the last few months. I guess I'll start with the basics. I'm a former Marine, honorably discharged after serving 2 tours overseas. I came back thinking I'd seen the worst the world could throw at me, but turns out, the real battle was waiting for me at home. I've been married to Janice for 8 years. We met when I was stationed in California. She was working as an administrative assistant for a small logistics company, and her smile hit me like a bullet. We clicked fast. She said she admired my sense of duty, and I loved how she made me feel like a person, not just a uniform. We had what I thought was a strong marriage. I was wrong. Things started unraveling when she got a promotion at work. Her new boss, Darren, seemed harmless enough at first, just your typical corporate type. I never liked the guy, but I figured I didn't have to, as long as Janice was happy. She started working longer hours, going on business trips, and bringing her phone everywhere, even to the bathroom. I chalked it up to her career taking off. After all, she'd supported me during my deployments. I owed her the same. But then, little things started piling up. She became distant, quick to snap at me over nothing. When I mentioned how rarely we spent time together anymore, she'd accuse me of being controlling. I dismissed it as stress work's demanding, right? I didn't want to be the insecure husband. Marines are taught to trust their gut, but for the first time, I ignored mine. That was a mistake. The first real crack came about 3 months ago. One of her coworkers, a younger guy named Brian, pulled me aside at a company barbecue. He looked nervous, kept glancing over his shoulder like someone might be watching. He told me, "Man, I don't want to get involved, but you should keep an eye on Darren. He's close with Janice." I asked him what he meant, but he clammed up and walked off. That comment stayed with me though. It nagged at me like a bad itch. I started noticing things I'd ignored before. She'd laugh at her phone during dinner, then turn it off when I asked what was so funny. She'd leave for hours on her days off, saying she was running errands but coming back with nothing. One night, I woke up and found her in the guest room on a late-night call, whispering. When I confronted her, she said it was a work emergency. She got defensive when I pressed her for details, saying I was paranoid. I didn't want to believe what my gut was telling me. I mean, we'd been through so much together. She wouldn't do this, right? But the distance between us grew, and I started to feel like a stranger in my own home. The final straw came when I got a call from Uncle Robert, the sheriff of our small town. He's always been like a father to me, especially since my dad passed. He asked me to meet him at his office, said it was urgent. When I got there, he had a folder waiting for me. What was inside made my blood run cold. Photos of Janice and Darren, holding hands at a hotel, her smiling at him the way she used to smile at me. Uncle Robert didn't sugarcoat it. "Tom," he said, "I've seen this kind of thing too many times. You deserve to know the truth." Turns out, Darren had a reputation. He'd done this before, groomed married women at work, controlled them, and discarded them when he got bored. What's worse, it looked like he was coercing Janice into some kind of scheme, though the details were murky. Uncle Robert said he'd keep digging. That night, I sat in my truck for hours, staring at those photos. The betrayal cut deeper than anything I'd ever felt. I wasn't just losing my wife, I was losing the life I thought we had. But as the anger simmered, another feeling rose: determination. Marines don't quit, and I wasn't going to let Darren or Janice walk all over me. Whatever game they were playing, I was going to find out, and I was going to win. I didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning of a conspiracy bigger than I could have imagined. After seeing those photos, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Janice smiling at Darren like he was her whole world. That used to be me. The next day, I started looking for answers. If Uncle Robert was right and Darren had a history of manipulating women, this wasn't just an affair. Something darker was going on, and I needed proof. I decided to act normal around Janice. I didn't want her suspecting anything, not until I had the whole picture. But inside, I was boiling. Every time she kissed me goodbye or texted late at night, it felt like another slap to the face. I started paying attention, really paying attention. She was meticulous about her phone, always turning it off or leaving it face down. But one night, she slipped up. She was in the shower, and her phone buzzed on the counter. I saw the name Darren pop up on the screen. My heart raced as I unlocked it. She hadn't changed her passcode. Rookie mistake. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. There were texts about meeting up, late-night hotel rendezvous, but it wasn't just about the affair. Darren was coaching her, telling her how to talk to me, what to say to keep me off their trail. One message stood out. Make sure he signs the papers by next week. We can't risk him changing his mind. Papers? What papers? My mind was spinning. Were they trying to take my house? My savings? I copied the messages onto a flash drive and called Uncle Robert. When I showed him the texts, his jaw tightened. Tom, this is more than an affair. Darren's playing a long game, and Janice is his pawn. But don't worry, we'll get to the bottom of this. Uncle Robert suggested installing hidden cameras and recording devices around the house. He said if Darren was pressuring Janice into something illegal, we'd need solid evidence. I agreed and spent the next day setting everything up while Janice was at work. That night, I overheard her on a call with Darren. My blood froze as I listened. I'm trying, Darren, but Tom's suspicious. He's been watching me closer lately. Don't let him intimidate you, Darren replied, his voice smooth and commanding. Stick to the plan. Once the paperwork's signed, he'll have no leg to stand on. I clenched my fists, barely holding back the urge to storm into the room. But I needed to stay calm. Whatever Darren and Janice were planning, I wasn't going down without a fight. I wasn't just going to expose them, I was going to take them both down. After hearing that phone call, I knew I couldn't let my guard down. They were moving fast, and if I wasn't careful, I'd end up blindsided. But if there's one thing the Marines taught me, it's that preparation wins battles. The next day, I decided to test the waters. Over breakfast, I casually mentioned wanting to review our financial paperwork. I said I was considering an investment opportunity and needed to double-check everything. Janice froze mid-bite. What kind of investment? She asked, forcing a smile. Just something my buddy Tim mentioned. A real estate deal, I lied. Figured I should make sure everything's in order before jumping in. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Oh well, I'll help you look through it later, she said quickly. But you know how busy work's been. Maybe this weekend. I nodded, pretending to drop it. But her reaction told me everything I needed to know. Whatever those papers were, they had to do with our finances. That afternoon, Uncle Robert called with news. He'd done some digging into Darren's background and found a trail of lawsuits and shady dealings. Apparently, Darren had a knack for targeting vulnerable employees, especially women, and coercing them into schemes to steal money or assets from their spouses. He'd been sued twice, but the cases were dropped when the victims settled out of court. This guy's dangerous, Tom, Uncle Robert warned. He doesn't just ruin marriages, he ruins lives. You need to be smart about this. Don't worry, I said. I've got a plan. The first step was finding the papers they wanted me to sign. That night, while Janice slept, I searched the house. I checked her desk, the closet, even under the mattress. Nothing. Then I remembered her work bag. Sure enough, tucked inside a folder labeled HR documents, I found a stack of legal forms. The title at the top made my stomach drop, Post-Nuptial Agreement. I scanned through the pages, my hands shaking. The agreement would strip me of nearly everything, our house, my savings, even my car. If I signed it, Janice would walk away with all of it, leaving me with nothing. At the bottom of the document, I saw Darren's name listed as a witness. I carefully placed the papers back where I found them and took photos of each page. My mind was racing. This wasn't just betrayal, it was a coordinated attack. Darren wasn't just manipulating Janice, he was using her to destroy me. The next morning, I played along as if everything was normal. Over coffee, I casually asked Janice if she'd been working on anything interesting at the office. Oh, just the usual, she said, avoiding my gaze. Why? No reason, I said, smiling. Just curious. But inside, I was already planning my counterattack. I wasn't going to let Darren or Janice take another step without me knowing. Step by step, I was going to take my life back. I knew I couldn't do this alone. Darren was slick, Janice was playing along, and I was outnumbered. Luckily, I had one person I could trust completely, Uncle Robert. That evening, I drove out to his place. It was a quiet drive, but my thoughts were loud. When I got there, he was already waiting on the porch, coffee in hand. All right, Tom, he said, motioning for me to sit. What VE you got for me? I handed him the photos of the post-nuptial agreement. His face darkened as he flipped through them. "This is bad," he muttered. "Darren's not just taking your wife, he's trying to bleed you dry. If you sign this, you're left with nothing." "I'm not signing a damn thing," I said firmly. "But I need proof of coercion. Something that shows Janice isn't acting on her own. Darren's pulling the strings, and I want him caught." Uncle Robert nodded, already thinking. "We'll need more than just these papers. What about recordings? Anything solid to tie him to this?" I told him about the hidden cameras and the phone recordings. His eyes lit up. "Good. If we can catch them discussing the scheme, we'll have enough to press charges. And if we can show Janice was manipulated, it could work in your favor during a divorce." I wasn't ready to think about divorce yet, even though I knew it was inevitable. For now, my focus was on Darren. Uncle Robert suggested another layer to our plan, tracking Darren's movements. If he was bold enough to show up in person, that could be another nail in his coffin. He lent me a small GPS tracker and taught me how to attach it to Darren's car without getting noticed. The next day, I waited outside Darren's office building. When he left for lunch, I slipped the tracker under the rear bumper of his shiny black SUV. My heart pounded the whole time, but I stayed calm. Marines don't crack under pressure. Over the next week, the tracker painted a clear picture. Darren wasn't just meeting Janice at hotels. He was visiting lawyers, shady financial offices, and even some of his past clients. It was a pattern, and patterns leave trails. At home, I kept playing my role. Janice had no idea I was onto her. I even agreed when she brought up the papers at dinner. "You know, Tom," she said hesitantly, "we've been talking about finances a lot lately. I was thinking, maybe we should get some things in writing, just to protect both of us." "Yeah," I said, feigning interest. "What kind of things?" "Oh, just boring legal stuff. You know, in case anything ever happens to either of us," she said, trying to sound casual. "I trust you, Janice," I lied. "Whatever you think is best." Her smile was forced, and I could see the guilt behind her eyes. But she didn't press the issue, probably thinking I was falling into their trap. Uncle Robert called me later that night. "I reviewed the GPS logs," he said. "Darren's got meetings scheduled with a couple of lawyers next week. I'll pull their records, see if there's anything connecting them to this post-nuptial agreement. In the meantime, keep collecting evidence." "Thanks, Uncle Rob," I said. "Don't thank me yet, Tom," he replied. "We're just getting started." As I hung up, I stared at Janice's empty side of the bed. This wasn't just about exposing Darren or saving my money, it was about taking back control of my life. And I wasn't going to stop until I did. By now, I was in full reconnaissance mode. Every conversation, every glance, every text Janice sent, I treated it like a clue. And finally, I got one. It happened late one night when Janice came home from working late. She looked nervous, distracted. She went straight to the kitchen, grabbed a glass of wine, and didn't even bother saying hi. I followed her in, acting casual. "Long day?" I asked, leaning against the counter. "Yeah," she mumbled, not meeting my eyes. She downed the wine fast, then pulled out her phone and started typing furiously. I pretended to grab a snack, watching her out of the corner of my eye. She was so focused on her phone she didn't notice me behind her. Then she slipped up. She hit send and set her phone down on the counter, screen unlocked. I saw the message she'd just sent to Darren. He's starting to ask questions. What if he figures it out? Bingo. I quietly left the room, but my mind was racing. She was scared, and that was good. Desperation makes people careless. It was only a matter of time before she or Darren made a bigger mistake. The next morning, I got another piece of the puzzle. I'd placed a small voice recorder under the kitchen table, knowing that's where Janice liked to make her private calls. Sure enough, while I was out in the garage, she called Darren. "We need to move faster," she whispered, her voice shaky. "Tom's been poking around, and I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." Darren's voice was calm and cold, even through the static of the recording. "Relax, Janice. He's bluffing. Just get him to sign the agreement. Once it's done, he won't be able to touch either of us." I clenched my fists, the anger bubbling up again. But I forced myself to stay calm. The more they talked, the more evidence I gathered. Later that evening, I met Uncle Robert at his office to play him the recording. He listened quietly, his face like stone. When it ended, He leaned back in his chair and sighed. "This is it, Tom," he said. "This proves Darren's coercing her. It might even be enough to get him arrested, but we'll need to tie him to the financial side of things." "How do we do that?" I asked. "Darren's meetings with those lawyers. If we can connect them to the post-nuptial agreement or your assets, we've got him," Robert explained. "I'll put some feelers out and see what I can dig up. In the meantime, keep playing dumb and gather whatever else you can." I left his office feeling more hopeful than I had in weeks. The walls were closing in on Darren, and he didn't even know it. At home, Janice was waiting for me in the living room. She looked nervous again, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "Tom," she began, "can we talk?" "Sure," I said, keeping my tone light. "I know I've been distant lately," she said, avoiding my eyes. "Work's been stressful, and I feel like it's affecting us." "Yeah, I've noticed," I said, tilting my head. "Is there something you want to tell me?" Her eyes widened for just a second before she recovered. "No, nothing. I want us to be okay. You know." I nodded, pretending to believe her. "We'll be fine, Janice. I trust you." The words tasted bitter, but they served their purpose. She looked relieved, like she'd bought herself more time. Little did she know, time was the one thing she and Darren didn't have. The cracks in their plan were starting to show. Janice was tense and distracted, and Darren was getting bolder. It felt like they thought I was clueless, which worked in my favor. The GPS tracker on Darren's SUV came through again. On a Thursday afternoon, it pinged at an out-of-the-way coffee shop on the edge of town. I decided to pay a visit. When I arrived, I parked across the street and watched. Sure enough, through the window, I spotted Darren sitting in a corner booth with Janice. They were huddled close, their heads almost touching. I snapped a few photos with my phone and debated going inside. But I knew confronting them wouldn't help. I needed more evidence. So I stayed put, watching. After about 20 minutes, Darren handed Janice a folder. She opened it, flipping through the pages while he leaned in, speaking quietly. Her hands trembled as she nodded and slid the folder into her purse. That was all I needed. I left before they saw me and drove straight to Uncle Robert's office. "She's meeting him in public now?" Robert asked when I showed him the photos. "They're getting sloppy." "She took some kind of folder," I said. "I'm betting it's more paperwork for me to sign." Robert frowned, thinking. "If we can get our hands on that folder, it could be the smoking gun. Do you think you can get to it?" I hesitated. Breaking into her things wasn't something I felt good about, but at this point, I was running out of options. "Yeah," I said finally. "I'll figure it out." That night, Janice seemed calmer than usual. She even made dinner, something she hadn't done in weeks. I played along, joking about how rare it was to see her in the kitchen. After we ate, she went upstairs to take a shower. I waited until I heard the water running before sneaking into the living room where she'd left her purse. My hands shook as I unzipped it, half expecting her to catch me any second. But there it was, the folder Darren had given her. I pulled it out and flipped through the papers. They were filled with legal jargon, but one thing stood out, a section outlining the transfer of my savings account to Janice in the event of a marital separation. I took photos of every page and put the folder back exactly as I found it. My heart was racing, but I'd done it. The next day, I showed the photos to Uncle Robert. He whistled low, shaking his head. "This is worse than I thought. Darren's not just trying to take your house, he's going for everything." "What do we do now?" I asked. "We keep digging," Robert said. "But this? This is solid. Between this and the recordings, we've got enough to bring him in for questioning. If he slips up, it could lead to a full investigation." For the first time, I felt like I was finally gaining the upper hand. Darren thought he was untouchable, but he was about to learn otherwise. At home, Janice was unusually cheerful that night, as if the weight of the conspiracy was lifting off her shoulders. She had no idea that I was already tearing it apart piece by piece. The day after I uncovered the folder, I decided it was time to test the waters with Janice. If I pushed just right, I might get her to slip up. That evening, we were sitting in the living room. Janice was scrolling through her phone while I pretended to read a book. I set it down and casually said, "You know, I've been thinking about those papers you mentioned. Maybe we should go over them this weekend." Her head snapped up, and for a split second, I saw panic in her eyes. She quickly masked it with a smile. "Really? That's great, Tom. I think it'll be good for us to get everything on paper. I nodded, playing it cool. Sure. I mean, we've always been good at planning ahead, right? She laughed nervously, then excused herself to the kitchen. I heard her phone dialing as she walked away. I crept closer, just in time to hear her whispering to Darren. He's on board, she said. I think we're good to go. Darren's reply was colder than usual. Don't celebrate yet. He's not as clueless as you think. Just stick to the plan, and don't screw this up. Her voice dropped lower, and I couldn't catch the rest. But that little exchange was all I needed to confirm my suspicions. They were setting a trap, and they thought I was walking right into it. The next day, I met with Uncle Robert again. He'd gotten word from a contact in Darren's legal circle. One of the lawyers Darren had been meeting with was preparing documents for multiple victims, not just me. This guy was running a full-scale operation, targeting married couples to steal their assets. This is bigger than just you, Tom, Robert said grimly. If we can take Darren down, we might be able to help a lot of people. That night, I decided to push Janice further. At dinner, I brought up the idea of taking a short trip, just the two of us. We could use some time away, I said, keeping my tone light. Reconnect, you know? She hesitated, clearly caught off guard. Maybe next month? Things are just so crazy at work right now. I nodded, pretending to drop it, but her reaction told me everything. She wasn't ready to leave Darren's side, not until their plan was complete. After dinner, she asked if I wanted to watch a movie, something we hadn't done in months. I agreed, letting her think she was reeling me back in. But inside, I was steeling myself for what was coming next. The more I played along, the closer I got to the truth. And when the time came to confront them, I was going to make sure they both felt the full weight of their betrayal. The more I played along, the clearer the cracks in their scheme became. Darren and Janice were rushing to finish whatever they had started, and their growing desperation made them sloppy. It wasn't just their texts or nervous glances. Janice was beginning to slip up in her lies. A few nights after the movie, she came home later than usual. Her excuse? A last-minute work meeting. But she forgot that earlier that day, she'd mentioned having no plans after work. How was the meeting? I asked casually, setting my coffee mug down. Oh, fine, she said, brushing past me to the kitchen. Just your usual boring office stuff. Must have been important if it kept you this late, I pressed, keeping my voice light. She froze for just a second, then laughed. Yeah, Darren loves dragging things out. Her mention of Darren felt deliberate, almost like she was testing how much I suspected. It took everything in me to keep my expression neutral, but inside, I was screaming. That night, I reviewed the latest recordings from the hidden devices. Sure enough, there was another phone call with Darren. We're almost there, he told her. Once he signs, the transfer will process in a week. You'll be free and clear, and he won't have a leg to stand on. I just hate lying to him, Janice said, her voice softer than usual. It feels wrong. Don't go soft on me now, Darren snapped. You knew what this was when we started. Focus on the payoff. Hearing her voice like that, hesitant, conflicted, it made me feel something I hadn't expected, pity. Maybe she wasn't as cold-hearted as I thought. Maybe Darren really was pulling all the strings. But that didn't erase what she'd done or make it any less of a betrayal. The next morning, Uncle Robert called with news. He'd gotten confirmation from his contacts that Darren's law firm was tied to multiple fraudulent financial agreements. While it wasn't enough to arrest him yet, it gave us a lead. We're getting close, Tom, Robert said. If you can stall signing those papers a little longer, we might be able to blow this thing wide open. I assured him I'd hold out as long as I could. That evening, Janice brought up the post-nuptial agreement again. She was trying hard to act casual, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. About those papers, she began, sitting across from me at the dinner table. Do you think you'll have time to look them over this weekend? Yeah, I'll take a look, I said, pretending to focus on my plate. Her smile was tight, forced. Great. Just let me know if you have any questions. That night, I didn't sleep much. My mind kept circling back to her hesitation during that phone call with Darren. Was she feeling guilty? Or was it just an act? Either way, time was running out. If I didn't take action soon, they might pull the trigger on their plan before I was ready. The next step wasn't going to be easy, but it was necessary. It was time to confront Janice directly, and see just how much of her loyalty was left. The time had come to finally confront Janice. I wasn't sure how much she'd admit, but I knew I couldn't keep pretending anymore. I needed answers, and I needed her to know I wasn't as blind as Darren thought. That evening, I waited until after dinner, when she was tidying up in the kitchen. I leaned against the doorway, watching her for a moment. She looked so normal, like the woman I married. But I couldn't ignore the weight of everything I'd uncovered. "Janice," I said, my voice steady. She turned, wiping her hands on a towel. "What's up?" "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." Her smile faltered, and I saw her grip the towel tighter. "Okay." I stepped closer, crossing my arms. "What's really going on with you and Darren?" Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked like a deer caught in headlights. But then she recovered, forcing a laugh. "What do you mean?" "He's my boss. We work together, Tom. That's it." I shook my head. "Don't lie to me, Janice. I've seen the texts. I've heard the phone calls." Her face went pale, and she opened her mouth to speak but couldn't find the words. "You're working with him to take everything from me, aren't you?" I pressed, my voice growing firmer. "No. It's not like that," she blurted out, panic flashing in her eyes. I can explain." "Then explain," I said, not backing down. She looked down, her shoulders slumping. "Darren, he's been pressuring me. He said if I didn't help him, he'd ruin me, ruin us." "Ruin us?" I repeated, anger bubbling up. "You think teaming up with him to steal my money is saving us?" Tears welled up in her eyes. "I didn't know what to do, Tom. He's manipulative. He made it sound like there was no other way. And you believed him?" I snapped. "You believed the man who's using you to ruin your husband?" She broke down, sobbing into her hands. "I'm sorry. I didn't want this. I swear I didn't." For a moment, I stood there, watching her cry. Part of me wanted to believe her, that she'd been coerced, trapped by Darren's manipulation. But another part of me remembered the texts, the secret meetings, the lies she told with a straight face. "This ends now," I said firmly. "You're going to tell me everything, Janice. Every detail about Darren's plan. If you don't, I'm taking this straight to the police." Her sobs quieted, and she looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. "You don't understand, Tom. Darren, he's dangerous. If I tell you everything, he'll come after me. After us." "Let him try," I said, my voice cold. "I'm not afraid of Darren. But you should be afraid of what happens if you keep lying to me." She nodded slowly, sniffling. "Okay. I'll tell you. Just promise me you won't let him hurt me." I didn't respond right away, unsure if I could even trust her anymore. But for now, I needed her cooperation. "I promise," I said finally. She took a deep breath and began to talk. Janice's confession started hesitantly, her voice shaky as she tried to gather her thoughts. I could tell she was scared, of Darren, of me, maybe even of the truth finally coming out. "It started a year ago," she said, avoiding my eyes. "Darren approached me after a company event. He said he admired my work ethic, that I deserved more recognition. At first it felt nice, you know, to be noticed." I nodded, keeping my face unreadable. "Then he started asking me to stay late for meetings, take on special projects," she continued. "He was charming at first, but then it got personal. He'd make comments about how I deserved better in life, how I was wasting my potential." I clenched my fists, but I stayed quiet, letting her talk. "I didn't realize what he was doing," she said, her voice breaking. "He made me feel like I owed him, like he was the only one who saw my worth. By the time I realized how manipulative he was, I was already in too deep." "In too deep how?" I asked, my tone sharp. She swallowed hard. "He convinced me to help him draft a post-nuptial agreement. He said it was just a formality, something to protect both of us in case things went south. But then he started talking about your assets, your savings. He wanted everything in my name. He said it was for my own protection." "And you went along with it?" I asked, my voice rising despite myself. "I didn't know what else to do," she cried. "He threatened to fire me, to ruin my reputation. He said if I didn't go along with his plan, I'd lose everything, my job, my future. And he said he'd make sure you never believed me." Her words stung, but I wasn't sure if they were enough to erase what she'd done. "Did you sleep with him?" I asked bluntly, needing to know. She froze, her face crumpling. No, she said quietly. He tried to, but I didn't let it happen. I swear, Tom. I never crossed that line. I wanted to believe her, but my trust in her was already shattered. What's the rest of his plan? I demanded. Tell me everything. Janice nodded, wiping her tears. He wants you to sign the post-nup. Once it's official, he'll start transferring the money into an account under my name. He has connections at the bank to make it look legitimate. After that, he plans to use legal loopholes to take his cut, leaving me with just enough to keep quiet. And you thought this was okay? I asked, anger simmering beneath my words. No, she said, shaking her head. I didn't know how to stop it. He said if I backed out, he'd frame me for fraud. He'd make it look like I was the mastermind, not him. I leaned back, processing everything. Darren had played her, just like he was trying to play me. But Janice wasn't innocent. She'd let it happen, chosen to betray me instead of coming clean. I'm going to fix this, I said finally. But you're going to help me. You're going to keep playing along with Darren until we have enough evidence to take him down. Do you understand? Janice nodded quickly, relief washing over her face. I'll do whatever you say. I just want this to be over. It will be, I said coldly. But don't think for a second that this makes us okay. Her face fell, but I didn't care. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her to sit with the weight of her choices. This wasn't just about exposing Darren anymore. It was about reclaiming my life, piece by piece. After Janice's confession, the next step was clear. Darren needed to believe his plan was still on track. That meant Janice had to keep playing her role while I worked behind the scenes to dismantle everything he'd built. The first thing I did was meet with Uncle Robert. I brought him up to speed on Janice's confession and showed him the folder with the photos of the post-nuptial agreement. He listened quietly, then leaned back in his chair. This Darren guy has a system, he said. He uses women like Janice as scapegoats while he takes the big cut. If we're going to stop him, we need to catch him red-handed, something that ties him directly to the fraud. What do you suggest? I asked. We set a trap, Robert said, his tone firm. We'll let Janice move forward with the plan, but on our terms. You'll agree to sign the papers, but we'll make sure everything is documented. The moment Darren tries to act, we'll have enough evidence to nail him. It was risky, but it made sense. Darren was meticulous, but his confidence in his manipulation might make him sloppy. That night, I sat down with Janice to lay out the plan. She was nervous, fidgeting with her hands as I explained what we needed her to do. I'll tell Darren you're ready to sign, she said hesitantly. But, what if he suspects something? He won't, I said firmly. You're going to act like everything is going according to his plan. Just keep him talking and let him think he's in control. She nodded, though her fear was palpable. Okay. I'll do it. The next day, Janice called Darren while I listened in from the other room. Tom's ready to sign, she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound believable. He thinks it's just a formality, like you said. Good, Darren replied, his tone smug. Tell him we'll meet at my lawyer's office tomorrow. Once the paperwork is signed, it's all downhill from there. After the call, I gave Janice a small recorder to keep in her purse. It would capture every word Darren said during their meetings. Uncle Robert also reached out to his contacts at the courthouse to flag any legal filings related to my name or finances. The next morning, Janice and I drove to the lawyer's office together. I insisted on coming with her, pretending to be the unsuspecting husband Darren thought I was. When we walked in, Darren greeted us with that slimy grin of his. He shook my hand, his grip firm but fake. Tom, he said, Janice tells me you're ready to move forward. Smart man. I forced a smile. Yeah, I figure it's time to get everything squared away. No harm in being prepared, right? Exactly, Darren said, leading us to a conference room. As we went over the paperwork, I made a show of flipping through the pages like I didn't have a clue what I was looking at. Darren explained everything with the smooth confidence of a practiced con man. But what he didn't know was that Uncle Robert had planted someone in the building, a deputy with a hidden camera, recording every word Darren said. By the time the meeting ended, Darren was practically glowing with confidence. You'll thank me for this later, Tom, he said, clapping me on the back. I smiled tightly, resisting the urge to knock his hand away. Looking forward to it. As we left the office, I glanced at Janice. Her face was pale, but she kept her composure. "Good job," I whispered once we were in the car. Now, it was just a matter of waiting. Darren thought he had me, but he had no idea the noose was tightening around his neck. After the meeting at Darren's lawyer's office, things moved quickly. He wasted no time putting his plan into action, likely thinking I'd fallen for the act. What he didn't know was that we were ready for him. A day later, Janice got a message from Darren. "Everything's set. You'll get confirmation by the end of the week." She forwarded it to me immediately. Uncle Robert, who was monitoring the situation closely, suggested we keep playing along while he prepared the legal team and law enforcement. "Let him think he's won," Robert said. "When he makes his move, we'll be ready to shut it all down." Sure enough, the next day, Janice received an email from the bank Darren had mentioned, confirming the transfer of assets had been initiated. But it wasn't complete yet. They were waiting for a final signature, mine. Darren called her shortly after. "Everything's coming together," he said, his tone full of smug confidence. "Once Tom signs off, you're golden. He'll never know what hit him." Janice played her part well, feigning nervousness. "I just hope it goes smoothly," she said, her voice trembling. "It will," Darren assured her. "Stick to the script, and this'll be over before you know it." We now had everything we needed: recorded calls, documents showing Darren's direct involvement, and witnesses ready to testify. The trap was set, and Darren was walking straight into it. The final step was signing the document, but Robert had arranged for a court order to freeze the transaction the moment Darren attempted to finalize it. As Janice handed me the pen to sign the papers later that evening, I looked at her and said, "Don't worry. This ends tonight." Her eyes were full of relief and guilt, but she nodded. The stage was set. Darren had made his move, but it was time for us to make ours. The next morning, Uncle Robert finalized the legal coordination. Everything was in place: the court order to freeze the assets, law enforcement standing by, and the recording devices ready to capture Darren's final move. Janice informed Darren that I'd signed the papers. His response was immediate: "Good. Meet me tonight so we can finalize everything." That evening, Janice and I drove separately to the meeting spot, a quiet cafe Darren had chosen. She went inside while I waited in the parking lot with Uncle Robert and his team, who were monitoring the situation from an unmarked car nearby. Inside, Darren was already seated, exuding his usual smug confidence. As soon as Janice sat down, he wasted no time getting to business. "The funds will transfer tomorrow," Darren said, sliding a stack of additional paperwork toward her. "After that, you're in the clear. Tom's out, and we split the assets like we agreed." Janice nodded, her voice shaking as she said, "What about Tom? He's going to figure this out eventually." Darren smirked. "Let him. By the time he does, it'll be too late. He won't be able to touch either of us." That was the moment Uncle Robert gave the signal. The cafe doors burst open, and 2 officers entered, badges flashing. Darren's smug grin vanished instantly. "What the?" he sputtered, standing up. "Darren Mitchell, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, coercion, and financial manipulation," one officer said, cuffing him. Janice played her part perfectly, acting shocked and confused as they escorted Darren out. I followed him with my eyes from the parking lot, watching the man who thought he destroyed me finally get taken down. As the squad car pulled away, Uncle Robert patted me on the shoulder. "It's over, Tom. He's done." Janice came out moments later, visibly shaken but relieved. "I told you everything I know," she said to the officers. I didn't respond. There were still things between us that needed sorting, but for now, I was focused on the fact that Darren's scheme had failed. With Darren's arrest, the weight of his schemes began to unravel. Law enforcement uncovered a web of fraudulent activities, revealing he had manipulated multiple victims, not just me. The evidence we provided was instrumental in building a solid case against him. Janice cooperated fully with the investigation, providing detailed accounts of Darren's coercion and manipulation. Her testimony, combined with the recorded conversations and documents, painted a comprehensive picture of Darren's operations. While her involvement couldn't be overlooked, her willingness to assist worked in her favor during legal proceedings. Uncle Robert's expertise was invaluable throughout the process. He ensured that all legal avenues were pursued, not only to bring Darren to justice but also to safeguard my assets and prevent any further fallout from the fraudulent agreements. In the end, Darren faced multiple charges, including fraud, coercion, and financial manipulation. The court proceedings were exhaustive, but the evidence was overwhelming. He was convicted and sentenced to a significant prison term, bringing closure to a tumultuous chapter in our lives. As for Janice and me, the road to rebuilding trust was long and challenging. We sought counseling to address the deep wounds left by the betrayal and manipulation. While forgiveness was a personal journey, understanding the extent of Darren's coercion provided some context to her actions. Life gradually returned to a new normal. The experience, though harrowing, taught me the importance of vigilance and the value of unwavering support from family. Uncle Robert's steadfast presence was a testament to the strength of familial bonds in times of crisis. Looking back, the ordeal was a stark reminder of the potential for deception lurking behind familiar faces. But it also highlighted the resilience of the human spirit and the capacity for healing, even after profound betrayal. The months after Darren's downfall were a whirlwind of emotions. Watching him face justice brought some closure, but the scars he and Janice left behind weren't easy to heal. I filed for divorce shortly after Darren's sentencing. While Janice's cooperation had been crucial in exposing Darren, her betrayal cut too deep to repair. She didn't fight the divorce. Maybe she knew there was no coming back from what she'd done. I focused on rebuilding my life. I moved to a smaller house outside of town, one without memories of what I'd lost. Uncle Robert stayed a constant presence, offering advice and the kind of quiet support that only family could give. About 6 months after the divorce, I crossed paths with Mara. She was a former Marine too, sharp, resilient, and carrying her own share of battle scars, both physical and emotional. We met at a veterans outreach event, and there was an instant connection. We started talking over coffee, sharing stories of our service and the struggles we faced adjusting to civilian life. Mara had an ease about her, a quiet strength that felt steady and safe. Unlike Janice, she didn't hide behind layers of deception or half-truths. As weeks turned into months, Mara and I grew closer. She wasn't just a companion. She became a reminder that not all relationships are built on manipulation or lies. With her, I felt a glimmer of hope, a chance to start fresh, to build something real again. One evening, as we walked along a quiet trail, Mara stopped and turned to me. "You've been through hell, Tom. But you're still standing. That says something about you." Her words hit me harder than I expected. She wasn't pitying me, she was recognizing my strength. And for the first time in a long time, I believed her. The journey to this point hadn't been easy. Betrayal had shaken me to my core, but it hadn't broken me. In the end, Darren's schemes, Janice's choices, they didn't define me. I did. With Mara by my side, I felt ready to move forward. The past would always be there, but it no longer controlled me. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was starting to live again.